Yes, it's a great privilege to welcome the next keynote speaker, Dr. Professor Kenneth Pargament from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. Ken Pargament has been a professor at BGSU since 1988, and in the year 2000, Pargament won the Virginia Stout Sexton Mentoring Award from the American Psychology Association for his generous work in encouraging both faculty, undergraduate and graduate research in psychology and religion. He received his PhD from the University of Maryland and published his first article the same year that I was born, which is the year 1977. Since then, he has published more than 150 articles and written 2 books, and he is world-renowned for his contribution to the psychology of religion. For me, the first day that I met Ken Pargament at BGSU, he showed me to a room where he kept all his paper copies of all his articles. And I could just take those that I needed. While looking at all this academic work in the psychology of religion, I, as a first-year PhD student at the time, and from Denmark, where we only have 1 PhD in psychology of religion, at that time we didn't have any, in admiration I asked him if he always had worked in the area of psychology of religion. And he replied in his dry, phlegmatic voice, "Yes, psychology of religion kept me out of trouble." And well, we are all very happy that you stayed out of trouble and spent a lifetime setting the stage for a large scale of research in psychology of religion. And even more, we thank you for choosing to be an encouragement and a mentor for all others in the area of psychology of religion. One of Pargament's best-known areas of research pertains to religious coping, and today he will lecture on Religion and Coping, the Current State of Knowledge. Later today he'll be chairing at 2:30 on the topic Religious Coping in Northern European Context. Please welcome Ken Pargament.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. One of the not so often recognized pleasures in working in this field is you get to meet such wonderful people. And I've said before, I think our area tends to attract exceptionally nice people. I really believe that, and Dorothy is one of them, and I had the pleasure of working with her when she visited us in the United States, and meeting other people here who, again, it's just great people to be with. And I'd like to thank Niels and Peter LaCour for organizing this conference. It's such an exciting opportunity. I met Niels in 2006 at Notre Dame, and we talked for a bit at that meeting, and he asked me if I had any advice. And I felt like kind of this kind of wise old man. I don't know about the wise, but I was certainly starting to feel old. And I said, you know, I just suggest build a network. Build a network. It's too complex and rich an area for anyone to work on his or her own. You need to have other people to work with to not only survive but thrive in this area, because we each have our own limitations. And obviously Niels has done just that and is helping to stimulate this really exciting group of people that I think is going to just continue to expand here and hopefully all over the world. So thank you very much. And thank you, Carol, for that wonderful overview. Here's an example of a survey done in the United States following the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, and 90% of Americans said they turned to their faith for solace and support. It's not an unusual study. There are many others that highlight the same point. For instance, this was a study, an early one done in 1985 among black and white elderly women with medical problems. And prayer was the most frequently mentioned, spontaneously frequently mentioned method of coping, more than anything else. A very, very striking kind of finding, but not unusual. Again, you might say, coming from this European context, well, this is America, people are religious, they're fanatics, this doesn't apply here. But in fact, there are studies coming out of Europe now that indicate that a good percentage of Europeans also report turning to their faith for coping when they face difficult times. A study by Christian Zwingman in Germany showed that a high percentage of cancer patients in Germany turn to religion in their stressful times. A study by Sylvia Moore and her colleagues in Switzerland also found that people with serious mental illness were likely to turn to their faith in coping with their mental illness. So nothing unusual here. What may be unusual is that it's taken us so long as healthcare professionals and researchers to recognize this fundamental point. And I just briefly mention, why is there been such a gap between what seems to be a phenomena in the world and healthcare researchers and professionals? And one explanation for this gap may be the fact that, especially in the United States, healthcare researchers and professionals tend to be quite abnormal. I don't mean abnormal in the sense of psychopathology, even though we can't rule that out, but abnormal in the sense of atypical. That healthcare professionals, and I should pick on my group, psychologists, more than any group, because in the US, psychologists are quite atypical. About 25% of psychologists reportedly believe in God in the United States, as opposed to anywhere from 88 to 96% of people in the United States who reportedly believe in God. So psychologists are atypical. And traditionally, psychologists have tended to be anti-religious. For instance, we have some Pilates quotes. It's not hard to find them. Classic quote by Freud, who talked about religion working by distorting the picture of the real world in delusional manner, by forcibly fixing adherents in a state of psychical infantilism, and by drawing them into mass delusion. But what do you really think, Sigmund? It's pretty clear what he was thinking there. Fortunately, the situation has begun to change. Prior to 1997, when I wrote my book on religion and coping, I was able to identify about 200 empirical studies on the topic. Since that time, we now have over 1,000 studies on some aspect of religion and coping. So it's really been a dramatic increase. And what I'd like to talk about with you this morning are some of the things that we've learned from this really rapidly expanding body of knowledge. And there are some basic points here, that religion really serves many functions, directed to many significant ends. Religion takes many forms. We'll review some of those. Religion adds a distinctive dimension to coping, and I want to suggest here that there's really something distinctive, even unique, about the religious contribution that we should take seriously. Probably the most complex of all issues is that religion can be both helpful and harmful in coping, that it in some ways can be understood as a double-edged sword, and that religion can be further integrated into treatment. Let me just digress here for a minute to say a few words about my own background in this area and why I kind of got interested in this particular area. As an academic clinical psychologist who practices 1 day a week, I kind of have my feet in two different worlds, the world of research and the world of practice. But for a number of years, those worlds were quite separate. My clinical work really didn't integrate any of my research work. As a matter of fact, people who knew I was a researcher were surprised I was a clinical psychologist. They never knew that. They thought I was a social psychologist or a personality psychologist. And my patients didn't know I did any work in the psychology of religion. You could say I had a dissociative disorder. I seemed to disconnect these areas in my life. Well, that bothered me because I felt like this just isn't making any sense. Part of the problem was that the research, I think, was not particularly relevant, including my own, not particularly relevant to clinical work. A correlation of 0.3 between some measure of religious involvement and mental health doesn't help me with someone who is dealing with a depression, who believes she's being punished by God, who's having trouble with her family because she's marrying someone from another religious tradition. The research is too distal, too set apart from the particulars of an individual's life to be useful or applicable. And that's one reason why we find practitioners generally don't read much research. And even researchers, PhD psychologists in clinical psychology, the modal number of research studies they do when they get their PhDs is 0. Most PhD clinical psychologists, after they get their PhD, never do another empirical study again. That may say something about our training, something about the field. Well, I turn to the notion of religious coping as a useful metaphor for a few reasons. One is I found it to be more constructive and positive and balanced, because coping suggests the possibility of effective coping. Religion can be helpful. It also suggests the possibility of ineffective coping. At times, religion can be destructive, which made a lot of sense to me. Coping also requires us to be much more contextual, to look at the kind of coping for a particular person dealing with a particular problem, which is what practitioners have to deal with all the time. We have to be interested in moving from the general to the specific, and the coping framework I found to be very helpful that way. Coping research also fit my preferred methodological approach. I value multi-methods. I value experiments and cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, surveys, qualitative research. They each have a unique insight to offer into human experience. But I particularly like working from the ground up. I tend to be more inductive. I just like talking to people and out of conversations building questionnaires and surveys and learning about people from the ground up, rather than starting with an elegant theory that comes from I'm not sure where, and then testing it. I like building it up, and that's what you'll see is the kind of orientation to this work. So with this background in mind, let me just talk about some of the things we've learned about religion through about 25 years now of work on religious coping. The first point, oh, you know what, I'm going to skip some of this on definition because I'm afraid we're just not going to have time. And Harold did such a great job with definition, so he spared me that. Okay, let me just then move to the first take-home point, which is religion is directed to many significant ends. It serves many functions. In fact, I believe part of the power of religion lies in the fact that it can meet the needs of different people. Not everyone turns to their faith for the same function. So, for instance, we find that religion can serve as a source of meaning. As Clifford Geertz once put it, he's an anthropologist and I love his writings, he says, the effort is not to deny the undeniable, that there are unexplained events, that life hurts, or that rain falls upon the just, but to deny that there are inexplicable events, that life is unendurable, and that justice is a mirage. So religion is designed in part to offer meaning. More recently, Crystal Park and Susan Folkman have written a very nice paper on religion as a source of meaning-making, religion as an attempt to help people reconcile questions of meaning raised by stressful events with their broader global sense of meaning in life, and religion is designed to do that. We find lots of examples of this function in action in particular empirical research. For instance, here's one parent who had lost her child. Here we have an example of religion offering a way of reappraising or finding new meaning in the loss. And she said, they say there's reasons for God to do everything, you know. I think that's very true because I think I love him, the second child, born after the death of the first child, a lot more now than I would have had our first son been here. So you may have some mixed reactions to that, but here you have someone who's able to draw out some positive meaning from a devastating loss. And it's religiously based. Empirical studies suggest that this can be quite successful for people. For instance, the study done in 2003 of parents who suffered the violent death of an adolescent adult found that religious coping was predictive of a sense of greater meaning in life in the child's death 5 years later. And in particular, these religious frameworks of reinterpretation of the loss were predictors of greater meaning 5 years later. But that's only one function. And I really stress that religion serves different functions, because in the literature now we have people making claims that religion is entirely devoted to one particular function. Nowadays, for instance, people emphasize a lot the meaning-making function of religion. And I say, absolutely, true, but it's not the only one. Religion serves other functions, and not everyone is particularly interested in meaning-making. For some people, the other functions may be even more vital. For some people, for instance, The key to religion is it provides a sense of who you are and a sense of who you belong with. It provides a sense of identity and community. And this was Durkheim's theory. The idea of society, he said, is the soul of religion. Here's a kind of anecdotal example from an interview we did, and this is from a priest who had lost his mother. And listen to all the communal kind of language in his description of the funeral. He says, "The funeral was astounding. The whole church, everybody was there. Many, many friends were there. Students from here, and the liturgy was a real experience of the resurrection. It was terrific. My blind niece played the piano, and my best friend David gave the homily. So there are so many powerful spiritual expressions and family expressions. It's hard to separate one from the other." That last line is key. You can't separate the spiritual expression from the family expression. It's all about relationship. One of the things, by the way, just a little aside, I find interesting about about spiritual focus nowadays is spirituality. We talk a lot about spirituality as having to do with connectedness. And yet, for many people, spirituality is measured purely as a self-contained, individual, introspective, subjective phenomena. Where's the connection with other people? Where's the connectedness with other people? It strikes me for spirituality to have ultimately legs, a lasting power. We'll have to broaden our understanding of spirituality from a purely personal phenomena to a relational phenomena, that we'll need to start talking about relational spirituality. My colleague at Bowling Green, Annette Mahoney, uses that term a lot, relational spirituality, to think about it in a context. I think it's a really important point. Another example of an empirical study illustrating the kind of communal function of religion is a study by Wink and colleagues in 2005, who found that involvement in religious institutions buffered the effects of poor health and depression. And it seemed pretty clear that the religious institutions were providing church-based support and a sense of personal identity to people dealing with poor health. And of course, there's religion as a source of emotional comfort. This was Freud's major point, that religion is designed to mitigate the terror and the anxiety the child feels in being in a world where there's helplessness and inability to master superior powers. And it's not hard to find examples of Freud's point. This is a study that was done by Jung in 1926. I think it was the Journal of Psychology. David, you may know of this. David Wolf is here.
I don't have the journal title on the top of my head.
Yeah, but I came across it years ago.
Yes.
But it was a very nice content analysis in 1926 of Protestant hymns, 3,000 Protestant hymns, and found the largest proportion of the hymns dealt with the theme of being comforted by a loving, protecting, sheltering God, which would seem to fit with the notion of religion serving this emotion-focused function. And we can find many other kind of examples of it, more anecdotally or clinically. Here's a woman who was by the bedside of her ill child, and she has this mystical-like experience. She says, "It was almost like someone had thrown a soft blanket over me. I felt a tremendous sense of peace. I tell people I felt the peace of Christ." Emotional, almost physical-like comfort. Now, I could go on. These examples are only illustrative. We could also talk about examples of religion as a source of impulse control, and the studies indicating negative correlations between religious involvement and drug use, alcohol use, promiscuity. All these speak to religion as a source of self-regulation. And some people seek out their faith to gain control over impulses. The 12-step programs, I think, are designed to encourage people with impulse control problems to turn to their faith to gaining mastery of themselves. Not through themselves, but by admissions of their own powerlessness, and then turning it over or surrendering to God. Religion is a source of power and efficacy. And religion is a source of personal transformation, a function that's often overlooked in coping, but a critical one. I believe Tor Torbenson is going to be talking some about that in his work in Norway later on this morning or afternoon. As important as all these functions are, though, there's one that's missing. And this is the one that is most central to the religiously minded. religion involves a search for the sacred. Religion is ultimately about the spiritual function of getting closer to something transcendent or immanent, but something that goes beyond one's ordinary self and experience. And psychologist of religion Paul Johnson put it this way. He said, "It's the ultimate thou whom the religious person seeks most of all." So I kind of hear him saying, yeah, all this psychological function and meaning and community and comfort, all these are fine, but you're missing the point. The point is, to the religiously minded person, it's all about seeking the transcendent. And if you take that out of the equation, you've stripped the soul from the phenomena we're trying to understand. We can find examples of a search for the sacred even in children. I love these examples from kids because you can find this in young children. This is from Robert Cole's Spiritual Lives of Children. Again, I think it's one of the best books on religion among kids that's out there, even though it's a little bit older now. And this 9-year-old boy, you get this sense of his searching process for the sacred. He says, "I'd like to find God, but he wouldn't just be there waiting for some spaceship to land. He's not a person, you know. He's a spirit. He's like the fog in the mist. I should remember that God is God and we're us. I guess I'm trying to get from me, from us to him with my ideas when I'm looking up at the sky." So again, we have to be careful of not trying to explain religion away, reducing it fully to psychological, social, or physical factors, but to understand, at least to the religiously minded, the spiritual function of religion is the most vital function of all. Point 2. Religious coping takes many forms. Now, efforts to measure coping in the general literature generally overlook religion. It's often only been measured by 1 or 2 items. But it can only 1 or 2 items of measuring religious coping provides too restricted or limited a perspective. We need deeper measurement. It's important, for instance, to measure who are the key players in religious coping? Who's involved? What's involved? What are the channels? What are the mechanisms? Prayer, meditation, and non-traditional approaches too can be mechanisms or channels of religious coping, such as music, media, relationships. Where is it? When is it taking place? In response to acute stressors, chronic stress, daily hassles? Where is it taking place? Privately? Publicly? Outdoors in nature? Paresh Teyamadi talks about spiritual coping in Sweden as being very environmentally based. So go to Sweden, you see people outdoors and just enjoying themselves. We might not see that necessarily from outside eyes as a spiritual experience. But I think the people there would say it's very much a spiritual experience. It's a transcendent connection happening in Sweden. It's not hard to find this kind of language of religious coping. And here we're talking about the hows of religious coping in people's words themselves. Again, this is how I built a number of measures of religious coping, just through people's own language. And if there's any value to these measures, I think it's in part based on the fact that it grows out of people's own lived experience. This is language people use themselves in the United States, which is an issue because that language may not be particularly relevant to other contexts. We're talking, this is American talk we're going to be hearing here right now. So one woman, for instance, dealing with schizophrenia, oh, this is not American talk, this is Swiss talk. Okay. She says, "I have no motivation to do anything, so I pray, I offer my suffering to Jesus. This gives me strength and comfort to do things." I offer my sufferings to Jesus. If I were reading this, I'd say, wow, that's got the makings of a good item, doesn't it? The notion of surrendering to God as a coping method. And that's how we can begin to generate ideas about how do people operationalize their faith in difficult times. Again, we're moving from heaven to earth. And this has a lot of practical relevance, as well as research relevance. We can also operationalize less constructive forms or more problematic forms of religious coping. This is a quote, was sent to me from one of my undergraduates. I was teaching the psychology of religion. I gave a lecture on religious struggles, and she wrote to me. And this was the letter, in part, she sent to me. She's dealing with bipolar illness, so she struggled in the class. I'm suffering, really suffering. My illness is tearing me down, and I'm angry at God for not rescuing me. I mean, really setting me free from my mental bondage. I've been dealing with these issues for 10 years now, and I'm only 24 years old. I don't understand why he keeps lifting me up just to let me come crashing down again. Spiritual struggle, in the words of an undergraduate dealing with bipolar illness. Again, look at the language. You can probably generate some items from this. I'm angry at God. What a great item. I'm angry at God. What a great, important phenomenon. Well, building on the language of people themselves, we've developed various measures of religious coping over the years. And an early approach, some of you maybe know about this one, I don't know if you can read it very well. This is a factor analysis of our original religious coping styles, where we distinguish 3 styles. A deferring style, where people, when they face crisis, give the problem to God. They say, it's too much for me, God, you take care of it. A self-directing style, which says, God gave me a brain, I'm going to use it. That's kind of like the American way. John Wayne. A collaborative style, which we think is the real unique contribution here, because people tend to think in terms of either God alone or me alone. When there's a third style, which is it's you and me are in this together, God. God is my co-pilot. God is my friend. God helps me. God is with me. God strengthens me. This is the collaborative approach. And which do you think is the most prevalent approach in the United States? Any guesses? Some of you may know. Which is most common in the U.S.? How many people would say self-directing? How many people would say deferring? How many people say collaborative? Yes, good. Yeah, most people in the U.S. collaborative, even though you can find some groups on the East and West Coast that self-directing is the highest. And among some more evangelical Christian groups, you can find groups where deferring is the highest. Anyway, if you know much about factor analysis, you can see, let's see, where's here we go. Much about factor analysis. You can see these are very nice factor loadings, and this is just a part of it. Very nice, clean factor loadings. And what we find is that, whoops, sorry for HT, I got this in the wrong place. What this shows is that it's the kind of religious coping that makes a difference. It's not enough to just study religious coping, we have to break it down. What it says is that people who are intrinsically religious or deeply committed, they can be collaborative in their coping, they can cope with God, or they can defer to God. In other words, they can defer passively to God or collaborate. They're both ways to be intrinsically religious. But collaborative religious coping is positively related to competence or mental health. Deferring religious coping is negatively related to competence or mental health. And we've replicated this a few times. So it matters how you express your coping. It gets more complicated, though, because we find at times, in some instances, when you're truly out of control, deferring makes a lot of sense. There are times when it makes sense to give up. Just like there are times it makes sense to stop self-directing, to let it go. So it gets a little bit more complicated here. More recently, Harold Koenig and I developed some other, other measures of religious coping, of positive religious coping methods, and here we have a variety of types of positive religious coping: seeking support, benevolent religious appraisals, active religious surrender, and so on. And again, in the effort to be balanced, we also articulated negative religious coping methods or struggles, such as anger at God, feeling punished by God. Struggles, we believe, are actually one of the ways that people are impacted by crisis and trauma. Crises and trauma impact people not only psychologically, socially, and physically, but spiritually as well. So a major life crisis can throw someone's spiritual orientation into chaos. They may not be able to square their experiences with the idea of a loving God. how could God be doing this to me? I've lived a good life. Why is God doing this to me? They're thrown into spiritual struggle of these kinds. And we've developed some measures of, we've developed some measures of each of these types of religious coping and gotten some very interesting results, as you'll see. Now, you may say, well, why do you have to be so specific? Why can't we just look at how often you go to church, how often you pray, or do you see yourself as religious, and leave it at that? The problem is that those don't provide any clear indication of what it is about religion that's making a difference. For instance, think about church attendance or prayer. I like to think of them sometimes as TV channels. You can turn the channel to a prayer channel, or you can turn the channel to a church attendance channel. You can turn it to a Bible reading channel. But what's really important, I think, as important as the channel, is what's the program that's being played on the channel? What's the program? What is on the channel? So we need to know, well, what is the person praying for? How are they praying? What's the object of the prayer? Why is the person going to church? What do they do when they attend church? What is their experience there? Are they going there to sell insurance? Are they going there to experience a powerful spiritual emotion? Are they going there to catch up with the latest news from their neighbors? What's the purpose of the religious experience? So what's the program that's being played on the channel? That's what we start to get at with religious coping. We get at we get to look at religion closer up. We get closer to the experience. And if there's any take-home point in all of this literature on religious coping, is that it makes sense to get closer to religious experience if we're to understand how it works in people's lives. We can't afford the distance of objective investigators. When someone says, for instance, in clinical work with me, I ask, well, how are you dealing with the situation? And they say, I pray. I don't say, oh. I say, well, what are your prayers like? Can you say a little bit more about your prayers? What do you pray for? How helpful are they to you in your life? We go deeper. We look for a closer look. Third point, that religion adds a distinctive dimension to coping. Psychologists, social scientists in general, have tended to reduce religion to presumably more basic phenomena, such as social support or meaning or emotional regulation. And certainly there's value to that, but there's a difference between trying to explain religion and trying to explain religion away. And we have some evidence that religion may add some direct effects to the prediction of outcomes, that it's not just mediated through other explanatory variables. There may be some direct, distinctive roles that religion plays. And I'd like to illustrate this with one study by one of my former students, Amy Wachholz. Amy was interested in studying spirituality and meditation. She has a master's degree in divinity herself, and she's done a lot of work in meditation. And she was struck by the fact that a number of writers about meditation try to disconnect meditation from its religious and spiritual roots. It's almost a mantra nowadays in meditation work that you don't have to be religious or spiritual to meditate. Well, Amy said, well, maybe in being so careful to disconnect religion and spirituality from meditation, we're really losing some of its critical, vital ingredients. So she came up with this idea, and I worked with her on it. A really elegant study where we looked at 83 college students with vascular headaches, and we randomly assigned them to one of four groups. A spiritual meditation group where they were taught to meditate to a spiritual mantra, like God is peace or God is joy. An internally focused secular meditation mantra, like I am joyful. Tried to match the mantras as best we could. An externally focused secular meditation, such as grass is green or sand is soft. And then a progressive muscle relaxation. Then we tested for changes in headache frequency and other psychological variables here. And what we found, if you look at the solid red line, that is the spiritual meditation group. This is headache frequency pre and post treatment. Diary reports of headache frequency. Pain tolerance, the cold pressure task where you stick your hands in ice water This is a bit of the psychologist's sadistic delight. It is actually quite painful. I tried it. I felt I had to do that. Part of me thought, well, anybody who keeps their hands in ice water, even in this experience, it's just a test of poor judgment. Migraine-specific quality of life, headache management, self-efficacy, and so on. Amy's conclusion and our conclusion was that it seems like there is that spiritual content adds an important ingredient to meditation, that the spiritual content adds something unique and distinctive, which is not consistent with some of the writing on mantra-based meditation in which people say, just pick a meaningful mantra. Well, the spiritual content seems to make a difference. We'd like to do something similar, and we've got something in process now on mindfulness-based meditation. Whether mindfulness-based meditation that's more explicitly rooted in Buddhist thought has an extra benefit above and beyond mindfulness meditation as practiced nowadays, in which it's more secularized. So, interesting. But we aren't the only ones who found these results. Others have also found that in the effort to, in looking at how religion relates to various outcomes, and trying to examine whether those effects are mediated by various psychological and social factors, so far the results haven't been fully supportive of that idea. Chris Ellison, for instance, looked at links between religion and distress in a sample in Detroit, and after throwing in all of the mediators that he could imagine, he concluded that the salutary effects of religious involvement couldn't be explained away in terms of these psychological or social resources, at least as they're constructed and conceptualized today. This is just an alternate point of view, that there may be something distinctive about religion. We may have some direct lines from religion to outcome that are unmediated through social support, through personality factors. There may be some direct effects that I think is really intriguing. Now, maybe the most challenging and finding we're learning about so far is this point here, that religious coping can be helpful and harmful. Niels, how much time do I have?
Still another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes? Okay, let me just focus on this one because I think it's so important. And note it is complex. Here's a plug. It's my shameless plug. If you find any of this interesting, this is my 2007 book on spiritually integrated therapy. I just got it from Google, so it's easy to download. If you find this interesting, you can read more about it. And here's a model that's explained in the book. You can't possibly understand it here, but I think it's kind of pretty. Even if you don't like it, it's elegant. In general, it looks like religious coping has beneficial effects, consistent with Harold's review of other religious variables. Positive religious coping methods seem to be tied to positive outcomes. And on the flip side, religious struggles seem to be tied to negative outcomes. And I could give you more specific examples of studies and go into the complexities of it, but I'm not going to here. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the complexities of this here. And note, for instance, that we find that it's not simply religious coping leads to positive outcomes. There are moderators. For instance, we find that religious coping seems to be more helpful to people who are more involved in religion. People who are less involved may have less of a religious orientation and framework to make use of the religious coping. So it seems as though people who are more deeply involved in their faith can gain more from their faith. We also find that characteristics of the situation moderate the results, that religious coping methods seem to be especially helpful in uncontrollable situations. And that may make some sense. When people are at the limits of their own control, religious coping methods seem to be especially valuable. And here's the most complex of all. There seems to be the importance of discernment, of knowing when to do what, when to match a particular coping method with particular demands of a situation. And I suggested something of this before, that, for instance, passive religious deferral doesn't make sense in a situation when you have the ability to master the situation yourself. On the other hand, active religious coping in a truly uncontrollable situation may be just as problematic. There are a couple of papers that have come out recently, one in JAMA in the United States that's looked at positive religious coping as a predictor of extreme, intensive end-of-life treatments, and found that people who make more use of positive religious coping are more likely to want extensive, intensive end-of-life care, which is quite expensive. And you could argue, and this is quite arguable, that it may not make the most sense. There may be more grace in this to be able to accept that the fact that you're facing the end of your life. Well, that's an example of the complexity of this situation. What should people be doing with their faith? Is this something pastors, chaplains should intervene with? Is this appropriate or not? Here we get into the issues of discernment. And I'd say we don't have easy answers at this point. But from a clinical perspective, from a practitioner perspective, I say, doesn't this mimic life, where we don't have such easy answers, where we really have to sit down with the patients and talk with them and work things out? This, to my mind, again, speaks to the value of a kind of religious coping perspective, because it does connect to people going through real-life events and illustrates just how rich and complex it can be. The other point I want to add here is that when we evaluate, when we talk about helpful and harmful, we really have to specify, what do we mean? We often think of helpful and harmful using psychological, social, and physical criteria. And if we restrict ourselves to those criteria, people in the religious world will be justifiably offended. Because to the religious mind, helpfulness and harmfulness has most to do with connection to the transcendent. And there may be some sacrifice of health on other criteria in order to reach a deeper relationship with the transcendent, and that's fine. I think, and we've done this in some of our work, it's important to begin adding measures of spiritual criteria of health and well-being that are persuasive to people in the religious world, to see how well our approach is impacting people on very salient spiritual criteria. Not that there's anything inconsistent with all of these, because I believe actually these are all generally correlated with each other. Health is health, and there are relationships among all of these criteria, I believe. In the measures we use, we find that spiritual criteria of health and well-being are correlated with these others, but not perfectly, which suggests there may be some trade-offs at times where there are hard decisions to be made about what do you do in this context. Okay, so this is going to leave you with the key question, which you're going to look at and you're going to say, that's the unsexiest question I have ever heard. Not that that's our business to raise sexy questions, but it is the key question we should be moving towards. How helpful or harmful are particular religious or spiritual expressions for particular people dealing with particular situations in particular social contexts according to particular criteria of helpfulness and harmfulness? Wow, you may say, I'm no longer interested in this field. But in fact, this is just where people in other areas of science have moved to in their questioning. If you're a psychotherapy researcher, you'll recognize this is the question that's now asked in psychotherapy research. Personality researchers ask questions like this. This kind of question marks the development of a field to greater sophistication. Just very quickly, I'll just note the last 2 points is that we're now beginning to move from research to practice. At Bowling Green, we've developed a number of spiritually integrated treatments and evaluated them, and found, as in the Amy Watholt study, that they in fact seem to add something to the treatment. Again, my book has lots of examples of these studies. We think there's a vital role for randomized clinical trials. We're doing a few of them now, and they're showing very promising results when you integrate religion into treatment. And into treatment for dealing not only with psychological problems, but spiritual problems. We've done that as well. And just briefly, I'm going to note some concluding directions. What are the implications of religious coping for non-Christians? Much of this work is Christian-based. The vast majority of studies use Christian samples. In some of our work, we've replicated our findings in religious struggles with Muslims, with Hindus, where we find struggles tied to depression, poor life satisfaction, with Jews and Orthodox Jews. So you can extend these studies to other religious groups. It's vital that we extend this research to other contexts, such as the European context and other groups. It's vital to look at religious coping, not just individually, but interpersonally. Annette Mahoney is doing really fascinating research on religion and spirituality among couples and families, relational spirituality. And it's critical to look at how it unfolds over time. We've only done snapshots. We need moving pictures. And finally, how do we evaluate the impact of these treatments on interventions? So for too long, we've neglected religion as social scientists and health researchers, and we've also neglected religious coping. Fortunately, the position has changed in recent years, and we now know religion is an integral part of the ways people come to terms with the most difficult, challenging times of life. And I conclude with this point: any effort to understand the ways people cope with life's greatest challenges that overlooks the religious dimension will remain incomplete. Thank you.